Hey everyone, this is going to start out as an overview of a bunch of things we've gone over the first half of the semester, and that all leads into an introduction to Derrida's thought. Specifically, the essay Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences. So, taking us back to the beginning of the semester, I have here an interlinear text of the beginning of the Gospel of John. And as you'll remember, the Gospel of John sort of rewrites the beginning of the Jewish scriptures, the beginning of Genesis. And for the Gospel of John, it rewrites it this way. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So, the first week of class we talked a lot about how strange that is, that in the beginning was this thing called the Word, and the Word was God, but also with God. And then we also talked about the word here. The English translation has word. The Greek, though, is logos. We spent a lot of time talking about what logos means. And ultimately, it means a lot of different things at once. Interestingly, however, one of its more primary definitions is that the logos refers to order. It refers to rationality. And as we talked about the way that the Jewish scriptures set it up, the way that the Greeks thought about it, and on throughout the Western tradition, the idea of order is bound up into ordering the world by binary opposites. So at the beginning of the Jewish scriptures in Genesis, when God starts creating things, he creates light, but in order to do that, he has to separate light from darkness, for instance. In order to create land, he must separate land from water. In order to create the earth itself, the earth must be separated from the heavens, etc., etc. Order means dividing up the world into binary opposites. But you can't have creation or anything that has any meaning in the Western sense of the word without a kind of order. And the logos is the Greeks and throughout the Western traditions way of referencing this primary sense of order. Now, jumping ahead to your reading of the Tilliard book, The Elizabethan Picture, you saw it was primarily a book about how medieval and Renaissance minds thought about order. And of course, for pre-modern people, to think about order meant to think about ordering nature and human society in terms of how God wanted it ordered. That God had a plan. You could know this plan by looking at nature, but also looking into the heavens and by reading the scriptures. God had created the heavens and the earth, and God had ordered them through this power of ordering that was akin to human rationality. That the human mind was as close to the logos as there could be anything. Now, this illustration here is an illustration of the geocentric universe. It's based upon mainly Aristotle, a lot of Aristotle, but also Ptolemy. And you see here in the center, here's the Earth, and the various elements that make up the terrestrial world. The element of fire, air, water, and I believe the other one's earth. Above that you have in concentric circles. The moon Mercury, Venus. The sun comes out here, Mars, Jovis, what is this? Jupiter, and Saturn. Up here you have the heavenly sphere, and this, it says here, is the home of God. And it says here, and all of the electorum. Electorum is Latin for the elect. So the home of God and all the people who are in heaven, the human beings whose souls are now in heaven. For pre-modern people, this here is the structure of the universe. As we've said, it's ordained by God, but nevertheless, this is a structure. And because it's a structure, it has an order. And because it's a structure with an order, it has a center. And to have a structure without a center is, as Derrida will say, kind of an unthinkable thing in Western metaphysics. In fact, to talk about structures as having centers and the centers being necessary might seem rather foolish, because it's a no-duh. It's a thing that we all understand about the world, that if there's a structure, there must be some sort of ordering principle to keep that structure coherent. And often the representation of the structure will be circles. The representation will be a concentric model. And for the pre-modern mind, this concentric model, in fact, is the model, it's a literal model. This is the way that God has set up the universe in concentric spheres. Now, this idea of order and of centers and circles and concentric design, this shows up in lots of different representations over the years. One of my favorite is from the beginning of the 17th century, and this is it's a table of towns and cities in England, and it tells you how far each of those towns or cities is from the center of England, which it's not a literal center, but nevertheless, it's certainly the political, social, and even religious center of England, and that is London. So you have this figurative center of England, and it makes sense that it is the center of England, but then you have these literal numbers here pointing out how far each of these towns and cities is from the center. This makes a lot of sense because, it would have made a lot of sense for someone in the beginning of the 17th century, because if London is the most important of the towns and cities, then the table here just shows like this sort of radius away from which each of the other towns and cities is. It's no mistake that this looks a lot like the previous figure, because this is a way of thinking about England not only as orderly, but as being kind of a microcosm of the universe. And we've talked a bit about that when we talked about Tilliard and the idea of order for the medieval and the pre-modern mind. And that is that England, if it's to be ordered in appropriate ways, then it needs to be a microcosm of the order of the universe that's been set by God. Now, this way of thinking about the way that the world and the universe is ordered doesn't disappear in modern times. And as you all know, I was in Washington, D.C. very recently, and spent some time at the National Mall. Here's a graphic of the National Mall. And This stuff about centers and ordering hasn't gone anywhere. We'll put it that way. And in fact, if you look at the National Mall, you see a lot of circles. Here around the Washington Memorial, of course, you see a number of circles all coming together. You see circles over here, and over here, the White House is situated. I don't know if the White House is over here or if it's just not represented right here. Probably is over here. And of course, the Capitol building is way over here. The Capitol building is probably figuratively the center of the United States in some ways. It's figuratively the center of the United States because it's the home of the bicameral Congress, without which the United States isn't a republic or a democracy, whatever it is. And let me show you something a little bit, a few photographs and whatnot that I took from my last trip. Here's a picture of the Capitol. It's large and majestic, and its largest feature is this dome. And the dome is at the center of the building. So on one side you have one half of the legislative branch. You'll have the House on one side, and on the other side you'll have the Senate. So the two halves of the bicameral Congress. And in the center you have this rotunda, and at the very top of it is a statue. It's like a female representation of freedom. And the next slide, I have a video from the inside of the rotunda. And before I start the video to show you, but it begins by it's pointed up at the top of the inside of the dome. And this is a fresco. It's called the Apotheosis of Washington. And it represents kind of a glorification or a deification of George Washington. And so it's, set up in the heavens, and this all makes a lot of sense when you're thinking about the height of the dome, and also the fact that that it's a center. Let me show you this video
A lot of
here.
that is, maybe, probably, when we don't know for sure.
And right there is the center of the building. So it began with, my little video here pointing up at the center of the dome, and then ends going down and looking at the floor and seeing, we'll look at it again, seeing that circle on the floor. There it is, with all these concentric circles around it. The thing that I found fascinating about this was that the circle that's right below, the center of this, is the literal, not just figurative, but the literal center of the District of Columbia. So the District of Columbia is this, as you all know, this entity that's not a state. It's an exception from the states that make up the United States. But it's an exception without which there is no United States. It's a district that is set aside or apart or outside of the structure of the United States to be sort of a ruling structure there. So without the district, there is no structure to the United States. In fact, there are no states whatsoever. And because, that it has this ruling principle, the district cannot be a state itself. It has to be exceptional. At the very center of this, if we call the district sort of a center of this structure, the very center of that is this building where the legislation happens. And not only does the legislation happen in this building, but it's a grand building with lots of symbolism, lots of representations of the kind of ordering principle that is supposed to emanate from the building. Okay, so going back outside to this view, this is the Capitol building down here. And as you know now, the District of Columbia has a literal center here. That leaves us to deal with, this is, of course, the National Mall. This is the Reflecting Pool. This is the Lincoln Memorial. And White House is over here. This is the Jefferson Memorial. So within this sort of crossways, this is supposed to be the seat of government. And at the very center of all this, though, is not the center of this thing right here, but the center of this is this monument, Washington Monument. Now, let me just point out that Washington Monument is something called, in terms of architecture, it's called an obelisk. And it's a really enormous obelisk. But what obelisks were, historically speaking, were monuments that were erected after a army would defeat, or a country would defeat another country and take over its land and occupy that land. And erecting the obelisk was a way to represent the occupation of the land, but also the conquering of the land. And you see these obelisks all over Europe. And one place that I've been to a few times where there's, in the city center, there are a bunch of obelisks, is Rome. And this is an obelisk in the Piazza del Popolo. And this is an ancient entrance into Rome, the old ancient Rome. And the obelisk here is one that the Romans brought from Egypt in, I think, about 10 BC, sometime around the time of Christ. But originally, this obelisk, which was erected by Ramses II, would have been a representation of occupation of land, but also conquering of land. Now, I want you to remember that in the Western tradition, land has been seen as a female figure. And as a female figure, land has the principles of stuff like comfort and nourishment and the place from which things are birthed. So part of the principle of fertility. Also, land is figured in horizontal terms because land is spread out. So land is spread out and it's female, etc. This is, by the way, very patriarchal, and that is this other principle, and this is the principle by which the obelisk is meant to represent. This other principle is figured as male, and that's this conquering, forceful, lots of times destructive, but also it was thought of as a rational principle and even a principle of ordering. It was thought of as a central principle, a kind of logocentral principle. And in these, really patriarchal pre-modern times, and up into the modern times when the United States erected this obelisk and named it after George Washington, we can see these patriarchal principles in the representations in the nation's capital. And the Washington Monument, no pun intended, stands as a prime example of this. So we have two centers here. Okay, we have sort of two structuring structures. One is the Capitol building, the center of the District of Columbia, without which there is no, United States. But just down from that, in the center of this mall, in the center of this representation, almost like a microcosm, of the United States government, in the center of that, you have this structure, which is meant to represent stuff like rational ordering principles. It's figured male. It is very phallic, obviously. And it's the opposite of the way that land is figured, even to the extent that it's erect and land is horizontal. Okay, let's see what my next slide is. Oh, here it is. Here's the Washington Monument itself. It's enormous, and it's a whole thing going to the National Mall. This is a big thing. I got no more to say about it other than the stuff about it's just a big erect obelisk. Let's hear. Oh, here's a nice pre-modern figure of the way that the universe is ordered, and this makes it pretty well. It places the male figure at the center of everything. Okay, so fast forwarding to something else we've looked at, the ideas of this guy. His name was Ferdinand de Saussure. He was a Swiss linguist, and in a lot of ways the father of structuralism. You read an excerpt from a course in general linguistics, and that the excerpt that you read is where Saussure, theorizes how structures of meaning work. And these structures of meaning are sign systems. And it's not as if the brain is incapable of experiencing the world or making meaning of the world without sign systems. It's just that human beings do make use of these sign systems in order to make meaning in the world. In fact, the way that we experience the world, the way that we make meaning of our experiences in the world, would not be possible without these sign systems. So, hand in hand with just our basic ability to sense our world, hand in hand with that are these structures. And you'll remember that the irony, or maybe the paradox of all of this, is that we make meaning with these sign systems, but there isn't a center to the sign systems. There isn't any sort of organizing principle. The only organizing principles that there are actually sort of push against the idea of the logos, or something strong and unchanging and structuring. And those principles of the sign system are difference. That is, the signs themselves have meaning because they're different from other signs. The other principle that sort of pushes against the older standard notion of what a principle is that the signs themselves are coherent in an arbitrary way. that the signifier and the signified don't have a natural relationship. They don't even have a rational relationship. Their coherence is they're arbitrarily related, and they cohere not because of any center, but a diffuse usage of those signs. And in fact, this is another thing that sort of pushes away from the idea that a structure has its organizing force from something central and vigorous and exceptional, is that these sign systems are radically social. They don't work, they don't have meaning unless people throughout an entire social system utilize those relationships. So it's not a central thing, it's a diffuse thing. It's not about like something like the idea of God that energizes and keeps and coheres the structure. It's about lots of human beings of all sorts of social stations using the sign system that keeps it together. And of course, one of the ironies that Saussure points out is that the usage of the sign system, which he called parole, that's just the everyday practice of the sign system. And the individual has a notion of that sign system that's very individualistic. In order to talk about the sign systems, however, we need to utilize a theoretical understanding of the sign system. It's not an everyday understanding of it. It's not bound to time and place like our everyday usage of a sign system may be. It actually doesn't exist anywhere except for in theory. And that the theoretical aggregate of a sign system is what you and I would call language, and I guess in the French it's langue. And one thing you can say about this is that in order to study the language, you actually have to come up with a construct that is not real. That there's not a single person that experiences the language in that way. It's actually a theoretical construction of the language that doesn't exist in reality. This guy right here is Claude Lvi-Strauss. I think he was born in around 1908 or so, and he lived until fairly recently. He was about 101 when he died. He's known as the father of structural anthropology. He's perhaps the most famous structuralist. And so the way in which he approached looking at human meaning making in a cultural sense was to look at structures. Oh, by the way, here he is. I think he's holding a monkey in this photograph. Is that a little monkey? Yeah, it looks like it. And you read, I think the first chapter of The Savage Mind. Won't go into that. But this just needs to, Claude Lvi-Strauss is the bridge that takes us from Saussure to Derrida. And the essay that you read on from Derrida, Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences, was a lecture that was delivered in 1966 at a conference about structuralism. And it was a celebration, really, of Claude Lvi-Strauss. The conference was at Johns Hopkins University, which is in Baltimore, Maryland. And Levi-Strauss was in attendance. I think a lot of people thought that the conference was kind of not just a celebration of his work, but almost like a coronation of his ideas and in the structuralist movement. So Derrida delivers a lecture. Let me show you a picture of Derrida. Derrida delivers this lecture, and it's sort of meant to celebrate Levi-Strauss, but also say something about structuralism and Levi-Strauss that had yet been unsaid. And this, of course, is what Derrida at the beginning of the lecture calls the event. So Derrida delivers this lecture. Claude Lvi-Strauss is in attendance, and he's pronouncing on something that he says has already occurred. And it's an event. It's an event in the history of the concept of structure. And he even says in the second paragraph, talking about the concept of structure, and he says that it's as old as the episteme or episteme. He defines episteme here for you. That is as old as Western science and Western philosophy. Another way of thinking about episteme is to think of it as the structure that sort of supports and makes available organized thought itself. And he goes on to say that he's not only talking in this essay about structure, but, and look at this on the next page, he's talking about the structurality of structure. And this is one of the ways in which he's talking about a center. But here he's really talking about the episteme, but also the center of structure as a philosophical concept, as a theoretical concept. And he says that because we haven't been talking about the structurality of structure, we sort of just see it as always there, as if it's natural, as if there's nothing to talk about. And it's here that Derrida talks about these centers of structures. And he says that they don't just orient the structure, they don't just organize it or give it coherence. He says that the center of the structure actually, and this is, by the way, this is in Western thought, that the center of the structure delimits what he calls free play. That within the organization of the structure itself, the boundaries of the structure that are set out by the center, that within that, the different elements within a structure are allowed some free play. And without this center, there's no limits, but also there's no coherence. And this is in the Western tradition. He says here at the end of this paragraph, even today, the notion of a structure lacking any center represents the unthinkable itself. Now, in the next paragraph, he's going to talk about centers in a way that I've already sort of talked about center when I was talking about the District of Columbia as being a kind of center of the United States. And that is that at the same time that the center is the thing without which there is no structure, it escapes structurality. It's not a part of that structure. It's exemplary. In a thousand different ways, it both makes the structure possible, so therefore it's exemplary within the structure, but yet it does not belong. This is like the District of Columbia, because the District of Columbia is the center, figuratively, the center of the United States. At the same time, it's not a state. So what Derrida points out here is that the center, he says, that, where is this? Right here. It's always been thought that the center, which is by definition unique, constituted the very thing within the structure which, while governing the structure, escapes structurality. And of course, recall that his essay here is about the structure of structurality. This is why classical thought concerning structure could say that the center is paradoxically within the structure and outside of it. The center is at the center of the totality, and yet, since the center does not belong to the totality has its center elsewhere, District of Columbia. The center is not the center. The concept of centered structure, although it represents coherence itself, the condition of the episteme as philosophy or science, is contradictorily coherent. And so I want to highlight that. A couple of things there, mainly this contradictorily coherent thing, and also the center is not the center. Because what Derrida is pointing out here is that Western rationality is based on this center that is in contradiction with the episteme itself. That rationality has at its center a paradox or a contradiction. In one way, that coherence itself, rational coherence, is incoherent. Okay, so turning the page, in this next page, Derrida talks about the history of Western ways of thinking. Specifically, he talks about the history of Western metaphysics. And that's in this first full paragraph when he's talking about the history of metaphysics. And he says that, one way in which you can talk about the history of metaphysics is to talk about the different terms that we've used for centers. He notes that these are metaphors and metonymies. He says here that he gives us a list of some of the ways that people have talked about this center. Eidos here is a Platonic idea of the forms. Arche, this means origin or beginning, and you saw this Greek word at the beginning of the Gospel of John. In the beginning, this is the word that you saw. Telos is ending, Energeia is force or energy. Ousia is just like being. But some other ways of talking about that he lists here: essence, existence, substance, subject. Aletheia is truth, transcendentality, consciousness, God, man, and so forth. These are the ways that Western metaphysics has talked about the center. And in this next paragraph, he goes back to talking about this disruption or rupture. They talked about just a couple of paragraphs before. And to say that, at the moment that people started thinking about the structurality of structure, they needed to talk about desire. This desire for a center that we knew either didn't exist or there was a problem with that existence. And he begins to talk about the ways in which people in the West have filled up this absent center. And the way he talks about it is not only just filling it up with the desire, but also filling it up with discourse. First, he talks about it in terms of sign substitutions. And that's right here at the bottom of the page. Turning the page over, he goes on to talk about, first of all, I love this phrase. He refers to the problem of the structurality of structure, the problem of the absent center in a metaphysics that requires a center as the universal problematic. And he says, at this moment of the event, everything became discourse. That this is the moment when, in the structurality, the thinking about the structurality of structure, where we recognize that there is no there. Kind of like in Saussurean linguistics, where you see that meaning is made up of relationships that are neither natural nor positive. They're differential and they're arbitrary. That those meaning-making systems don't have a grasp on something immutable, something even rational. In fact, it's only desire and words in signifying that we fill this central absence with. And here at the beginning of the next paragraph, he uses a term that will be very important to this class, and maybe you're thinking about, sort of intellectual concepts for the rest of your life. That is the term decentering. So what happens when one thinks about the structurality of structure in these terms is the center becomes absent and things are decentered. You have structures without centers. And at this point in the essay, what Derrida is trying to do is to hold on to this idea of play within the structure and allow that play to take over the structure completely. The old model had been that the structure has this exemplary, even center that doesn't actually belong, that keeps the structure coherent, but allows for a certain amount of free play within it. Here, if we admit that the center is not there at all, and we only think it's there because we desire it to be, and then we fill it up with discourse. If that's not there, what Derrida wants to talk about is the way in which free play pervades the entirety of the structure, without this central authority. And this is perhaps sort of like the bicameral Congress being the center of the United States. I mean, the way in which it's represented in the architecture and the geography of the District of Columbia. Because what is inside the Capitol? What is there besides the building and the art and the mythos of the people in the place? The Apotheosis of Washington. What is there but a bunch of human beings arguing, creating texts, making displays, and a lot of times acting in ways that most reasonable people probably think of as foolish. This is the very center of the center of the center for the United States. And what is it? Well, it's discourse. Now, turning to the next page, this is when Derrida talks about Levi-Strauss specifically. And he begins the page talking about Levi-Strauss in the beginning. I think it's the preface of The Raw and the Cooked, where Strauss claims that he seeks to transcend the opposition between the sensible and the intelligible. That is the sensing part of the person and the thinking part of the person, by operating from the outset at the level of science. So in a sense, he's saying there that he's operating at the level of structure, of the science system. Derrida goes on to say that doesn't actually make much sense, because one is never able to operate outside of science. And in fact, it's signs themselves that allow us to think about science. Now, I'm going to skip ahead to page 359. There's 356, 357, 358, 359. And Derrida's talked a lot about Levi-Strauss throughout these pages. And where he lands at this moment is to talk about the way in which Levi-Strauss is, smart enough to see the contradictions in the ways of looking at structures. At the bottom here, he talks about how that Levi-Strauss in elementary structures knows that the distinction, the opposition between nature and society is not an adequate distinction. It doesn't seem to make much sense, but nevertheless, there is justification in using it in modern sociology. Right here, Derrida says, Levi-Strauss will always remain faithful to this double intention to preserve as an instrument something whose truth value he criticizes. So, if you can't actually justify the adequacy of a concept of finding truth, but nevertheless you have no other tool to use, then you can simultaneously criticize what this tool allows you to do at the same time that you utilize the tool, because you have no choice. And in the next paragraph, Derrida quotes Levi-Strauss doing this in The Savage Mind. I want to go to the next. There we are. And here, the first full paragraph on this page, 360. So that was on the one hand that Levi-Strauss will criticize a tool or a way of thinking at the same time that he will utilize that. And then he says, on the other hand, Levi-Strauss presents what he calls bricolage, what might be called the discourse of this method. The bricoleur, says Levi-Strauss, is someone who uses the means at hand, that is, instruments he finds at his disposition around him, those which are already there, which had not been there especially conceived with an eye to the operation for which they are to be used, and to which one tries, by trial and error, to adapt them, not hesitating to change them whenever it appears necessary. And so what he's getting into here when he talks about bricolage is, on the one hand, he was talking about there are these tools that we cannot, that we think that there are these tools that don't seem adequate for the task at hand, but we nevertheless use them for that task because we don't have anything else. But in bricolage, one doesn't use a tool for a task at hand. One uses a tool that's been designed for something else in order to perhaps, in a different usage, to perhaps bring about an understanding that actually might be more truthful, or at least can give us another, way of looking at that problem. So this is where Derrida talks about Levi-Strauss's youth of mythology, what he calls mythopoetics. And here Derrida talks about this mythological criticism that Levi-Strauss is doing. He says it's a lot like bricolage. And toward the bottom of this third full paragraph, he says, in effect, what appears most fascinating in this critical search for a new status of discourse is the stated abandonment of all reference to a center, to a subject, to a privileged reference, to an origin or an absolute archaea. The theme of this decentering could be followed throughout the overture of his last book, The Raw and the Cooked. I shall simply remark on a few key points. So he's giving great praise to Levi-Strauss at this moment, saying that he has decentered his own critiques, he has decentered his own structuralist tools. Okay, turn to the page. That is 362. Skip it to the following page, 363. And because what Derrida is, he's just given a couple examples in that page and a half or so. But I want to go down here to where he says, Thus it is at this point that ethnographic bricolage deliberately assumes its mythopoetic function. But by the same token, this function makes the philosophical or epistemological requirement of a center appear as mythological, that is to say, as a historical illusion. So one of the things he's saying here is that the center becomes mythological. And a couple of pages earlier, he's actually hinted at this idea that mythology is incoherent on its own because it combines logos and mythos. And I want you to think back to our first meeting together. I gave you a handout in which I give you a snippet from a Greek, ancient Greek English dictionary. And under logos, one of the things it said about logos was that it was the opposite of logos was mythos. And so a couple of pages before this, Derrida has suggested that that's something rife for a deconstruction, that there's an incoherence there, combining these opposing terms, mythos and logos. And here he's saying that this ethnographic methodology of the bricolage that Lvi-Strauss is using to construct his way of thinking about human nature has as its center mythology, which as a way of supposedly providing truth value to us at the same time that it's an absolute fiction. Or in another way to think about it, it combines binary opposites from ancient times, the logos and the mythos. Moving ahead a couple of more pages, let's see here. This is 363. This is 364. And this is 365. And it's at this point in the essay that Derrida talks about what you might be thinking of as a problem with thinking about a centerless way of making meaning in the world. And that is without structuration. That structuration is provided by like a center that has reality, that has presence, that doesn't falter, that doesn't change, that's based on, a divine rationality even. Without those centers, then, and without the limits that those centers produce, then our experience in the world is totalized. That there is no way of distinguishing between not only just one moment to the next, but one experience from another experience. There's no way of organizing. There is no logos, or there is no sense of logos. If we admit to these contradictions that structuralism has made apparent to us. So what Derrida says on this page is that rather than thinking about sort of a lack of the meaning that delimiting the world gives us, we can first of all admit that we're always going to be using language as we're living in the world, and that language will always provide the structure for our experiences and will provide us a means of making meaning. So because we're language using animals, then we'll never not have that structure. And he says, and this goes back to the very beginning of the essay, in which he theorized this idea of free play, total free play within a structure without a center. Total free play to the extent that that center that we might need is actually just filled up with discourse. he says that that's exactly what you have. Your experience is going to be made up of these structures of total free play. And he imagines that perhaps paradoxically, provides the delimiting one needs to make meaning in the world, at the same time that it also provides an absolute free play within those structures. And there is a kind of freedom in that. At the very bottom of this page, he also talks about that, the discourse, like is discourse as a supplement for the absence of a center, doesn't just sort of fill up that absence, but it actually provides abundance. And it provides abundance because signification is always abundant. There's always another sign to supplement the sign that had been in that place. So if you see the discourse or the free play of signs as supplementing that, monolithic, phallocentric center, then you actually, not only do you get a world of free play, but you also get an abundance. Now, I want to go, I think, 4 pages ahead to page 369. And this is going to take us to the end of the essay, and I think the essay ends in something of a bang. So this is 365. This is 366. This is 367. This is 368. And here we are at 369. And here I want to bring us back to my discussion of the Eucharist, and as that pertains to Hamlet, and also as it pertains to the metaphysics of Western philosophy. From the ancient Greeks in the West, being has been considered as dual. And it's dual at least in this respect, and that is in the human experience of being, one has access to appearances, but there's always a necessary reality lurking behind those appearances. This is important for the Eucharist, of course, because, the traditional Catholic Church was in a way a kind of a center of Western civilization for, 1,000 years, maybe more. And at the center of that institution was this sacrament of the Eucharist. This was supposed to be, the most significant thing that happened at the most significant event in the church's life, and that is the Eucharist occurs during the Mass. And what happens in the Eucharist is that the cracker is turned into the body of Christ, and it's a miracle. And good Christians can participate in this miracle to the extent that they eat the cracker, which is the same thing as, or on a deeper, real level, the same thing as, or not, I keep on saying the same thing as, it is the eating of the body of Christ. It is coming into contact with God so closely that you're literally eating God's flesh. As weird as that sounds. Okay. For centuries in the West, metaphysics is bound up in this idea of the presence of the transcendent God on the earth. And human beings in Europe could endure all sorts of lack, all sorts of deprivations, all sorts of pain and suffering, knowing that a miracle occurs all over the world, or at least in their world. And that miracle is this, that God becomes present to them and their bodies merge with God's body. And that's this second to last page of the essay. This is when Derrida is talking about the metaphysics of presence. This is what's lurking behind that. This desire, this need for all the institutions of the West to be in contact with this transcendental signified, this transcendental presence, the logos itself. If you want to go back to the gospel, the beginning of the Gospel of John, when John says that God is the logos. And at the beginning of this first full paragraph on page 369, Derrida talks about, he says that this idea of play that he's been, behind for the whole of the essay, he says that, play disrupts presence. The presence of an element is always a signifying and substitutive reference, inscribed in a system of differences in the movement of a chain. Play is always a play of absence and presence. But if it is to be thought radically, play must be conceived of before the alternative of presence and absence. Being must be conceived of as presence or absence on the basis of the possibility of play, and not the other way around. And so he's asking us to think about play as something that comes before our concerns about absence and presence. And in the next paragraph, he wants to talk about not being sad or nostalgic or even feeling loss from the loss of the center, or from the admitting that play came before center, or admitting that it's all discourse anyway. And what he says here, he opposes Rousseau and Jacques Rousseau and Friedrich Nietzsche. And, he says it's not the old sad, negative, nostalgic, guilty, Rousseauistic side of thinking of play. It's Nietzschean affirmation. That is, a joyous affirmation of the play of the world and of the innocence of becoming. The affirmation of a world of signs without fault, without truth, and without origin, which is offered to an active interpretation. This affirmation then determines the non-center otherwise than a loss of a center. And it plays without security, for there is sure play. That which is limited to the substitution of given and existing present pieces. In absolute chance, affirmation also surrenders itself to genetic indetermination, to the seminal adventures of the trace. And so he's saying here that there's all sorts of freedom in giving up of the center, at the same time that you should know that its sign systems are making meaning of this experience of ours, and you don't have to do without it. And he even says at the bottom, and this is perhaps especially interesting in our world where people are sending off their DNA to 23andMe to find out who they are and where they're from. He says that that you receive. There's even genetic indetermination that comes about in this sort of post-structuralist way of looking at the world. And rather than helping you interpret the last few paragraphs of the essay, I think I'm going to leave that open to you, and leave that open to that freedom of interpretation that Derrida sort of promises to us if we'll let go of authority, let go of the authoritative voice. And in some ways, that's what you probably find helpful that I talk to you about this essay to begin with, but also there's probably a moment where I should stop talking about it and allow you to start making your own determinations, for you to experience that free play, and for you to maybe even find some joy in freedom of interpretation. So that's it for me. Thanks a lot for listening to me and watching this video. And I look forward to talking to you more about these issues.